Hello everyone and welcome to this week's After Effects scripting tutorial. Today, this tutorial is basically going to be After Effects scripting basics for expression pros. Now, expressions are more and more becoming like scripting itself as they've updated to the newer JavaScript engines. So today I want to kind of show you the basics of accessing, reading, modifying, and just some basics of scripting which heavily relate to the field of expressions and some functions that even match one-to-one between them. Basically, I have this simple setup here which has an expression. If the time is less than 30, the image is static, and if it's greater, else, apply a wiggle expression. And I have this basic script which will allow me to apply my own wiggle expression with these two values. Whatever I put in here could be something crazy like 100 times a second, 40 values. And when I hit go, I'm going to get an alert, which we'll discuss later. But now I've replaced my expression completely with this custom text based on some input from my script. So hopefully you can then take these basic concepts as an expression pro and then start learning scripting using this already existing bridge knowledge you have. The trickiest part is learning the scripting specific stuff, but since you are an expression pro, you already know all the hard stuff. You know the math, the expressions, and how those relate to After Effects. Now you just have to learn some of the scripting UI and other connections that can be made. Before we get started with this video, I do want to remind you down below, hit subscribe and the bell icon to be notified of new videos coming out twice weekly in the channel. And down in the description, you can follow us on GitHub for coding updates, as well as Instagram for other live updates. If you haven't already joined the Discord server, make sure you do so to get help with scripting, extensions, plugins, submit tutorial ideas, hang out with awesome members, and much more. And if you'd like to help support us on YouTube, you can do so down below by becoming a member or supporter. That comes with cool perks like Discord status, badges, emojis, member polls, member live streams, and also check out the links to AE Scripts, Gumroad, and Adobe Exchange down below to see some other cool stuff I make. So this is the script we're going to actually be writing today. When we launch it, it looks just like what I showed you. And although this is simple, it's just going to do the basics we want to sort of get you off to the races and started writing scripts, whether or not you've written a few before. But as an expression person, I feel like there is a huge advantage to starting to learn scripting over someone that just knows some After Effects and then tries to learn. So we're basically going to be writing the script today. I'm not going to be going over all of the super basics of writing scripts, like what programs to use. I am going to be using ExtendScript just for simplistic purposes today, but you can use Visual Studio Code, and I have tons of other tutorials on scripting setup, how to learn on your own, and all kinds of other topics in the playlist and videos on this channel. One important thing to get is the After Effects scripting guide, which you can find for free, of course, in PDF form or in HTML form. And this is just going to contain all of the useful stuff that we can access, everything from the application level down to layers and properties, expressions, and keyframes. So, although I'm not going to go over in detail every single line of code I write today, I'm going to explain some of them, but I think you'll get the gist of it as an expression pro. So again, we just have this setup here, After Effects composition with a single layer. We have an expression on the position which says if the time is less than 30 seconds, have it be static, and if it's greater, wiggle it. Our goal is to then create two edit text boxes, one which contains the first value of our wiggle, and the other which contains the second value of a wiggle expression, and then our go button will execute the actual changing of that expression. Alright, so we have our UI up here for reference. We don't have to worry about that. We can start coding. I will go ahead and zoom in here to make things more visible, and we're going to start by programming the UI. We're going to start by saying window, var window. A variable is just a placeholder for something. You can call it whatever you want. But we do need to call a new window to create a brand new pop-up window. The first argument is a string called palette because that's the type of window for this kind of floating window we have here. And then if you want, you can have a name. I'll just call script name. That needs to be a string, and the third argument, which is sort of sizing and position, you can put to undefined, and it will automatically do everything based on whatever you put inside of it. So then we're going to grab our window variable and say orientation is equal to a column. This is going to allow us to have all of the stuff in here basically go from top to bottom. Otherwise, it would be set to a row, which we can also say which would put it from left to right. We want everything from top to bottom though, so we're going to use the keyword column. Now we can simply create three elements. We have what's called these edit text boxes, just the text inputs, and then a button. We're going to basically call them in a very similar way to how we created this window here, except we're going to be adding them to the window. So we'll create a variable called, we can call it input1. We could also create a second one called input2. Each of these is going to represent one of these little input boxes here. Now, how do we actually create the input box? Of course, I have tutorials on creating floating and dockable UIs, which you can check out. But we're going to go ahead and say window, because that's what we're going to add it to. We're going to add something. You can see it does some autocomplete here in extend script. We have the type, the bounds, the text, and the properties. So the type of thing we want to add is called an edit text, and it needs to be all lowercase, spelled just like that. The next argument is undefined, the same as this undefined here, where we don't want to define any spacing. For now, let the script figure it out itself. Then the last argument, what do we want it to say inside of our text? We can just say test for now. I'm also going to copy and paste this to the next line because this is a second input, which is basically the same thing. We can say test2. Now, if we wanted to test this and run it, I can connect it to After Effects, try and run it, but we don't have, firstly, an edit text type element, probably because I used 3 T's instead of 2. If I try and run it though, nothing happens. That's because we actually need to tell our window to appear. So if I say window.show, needs to be in parentheses because we're executing an action. Now it's going to pop up and show. You can see we have our script, which has the name cut off here because it's not quite big enough. And then we have test and test2 as our inputs. Another useful thing we can do is duplicate this and say center and then show. That way your script doesn't somehow appear up here or all the way over here or anywhere random. You can make sure it's in the center of your screen for the user to find. The last element we're going to add here is the button I had originally. So I'll just create a variable called button is equal to our window. What are we going to add? Usually in lowercase, a button, undefined size, and inside of our button, let's say go. Now if I go ahead and run this, you can see now we have our edit text and our button. One more thing I want to do before we get to the actual expressions interaction here is to make these inputs a little bit bigger. There's a few ways to do that, but the easiest way for me, honestly, is to use the characters attribute. So if I say, grab my input 1 and the characters attribute, we can set this to an integer, like 3, 4, 5, and that's going to basically estimate how many characters should fit inside of it, and it's going to size appropriately. So if I say 3, it's going to size our first one here for approximately 3 characters. If I say 30, you can imagine it's going to be a lot bigger to support for 30 characters. So in this case, I think 4 should be fine. I'm going to copy and paste this below our input 2 and change the variable, of course, to input 2. Now we have some nicely sized text boxes here. This is going to be enough for the numbers we're going to use for our expression. So by default, we can just say 4, 60. So there's going to be our initial state of our UI with our script name, our first value, and our second value. Now all we have to do is figure out how do we connect when we click on this button to actually do something useful. Well, to get started, we need to say our button, and anytime we have a button, to basically recognize when we click on it, we do what's called an on click. Now you can see it's going to autocomplete for me here. But in this case, instead of the parentheses, we're going to say is equal to a function, and this needs parentheses as well, and open and close brackets. Basically what this is saying is when we click on our button, it needs to be on uppercase click, we're going to run some random function. This function is not defined, doesn't have a specific purpose, but there's going to be some code inside of here which we want to treat like a function that we run after we click on our button. So what do we want to do when we click on our button? Well, first let's do a test. We can do what's called an alert, and that's going to give us a pop-up message saying whatever we put inside of here inside of a string. So we can just say test, test, test. Run the script. Now when we click on go, we're going to get a pop-up that says test, test, test. Now if you're ever struggling to figure out what's wrong with your script, you can always put these all throughout your code and say, okay, I got to this test, 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 but not this one, so this must be my problematic code. That's one of the most basic ways you can start debugging and finding issues inside of your code, if you don't know what the problem could be. Use alerts. You can even alert variables. I can alert this button. It may not give me very useful information. The engine's busy because we have an alert open. We hit go. It's going to give us an object button. Not super useful in this case, but you could get like the button.text, and that's going to say go. So there is some useful information you can get. You can grab variables, alert text of your own choosing. But now that we know we're inside of this function, when we click on the button, we can put in whatever actual functionality we want. And this is going to be sort of the main interaction with scripting. We're going to go pretty quick through this, just getting a quick composition, a quick layer, getting this position value and the expression within it. So to do this, first, I'm actually going to create what's called a function call. We're going to say main, and it's going to be parentheses. And what this means is we basically want to call a function called main. This is so we can more easily organize our code. We might have a function called add 1 plus 1. We may have a function called add 2 plus 1. This is a very rudimentary example, but it allows us to organize our code into different modules essentially. And anytime we want, we can call one of these modules. And basically what we're going to do is have a function which does some stuff called main. I like to do main just because it's a legacy thing from the C++ days, to have like your main function, which is like the main overall thing. There might be more functions inside of that which are nested, but I like to call the main one main. You can call it whatever you want. So instead of add plus 1 plus 1, we're going to call main. And you might wonder, what are these parentheses for? The parentheses, aside from indicating that it's not a property, it's an actual kind of an action to take. You can see we center and show our window with an action. We run a function with an action. Inside of here, we can add what are called arguments. We can pass one value to a function. So if I wanted to, I could say, I want to pass the number 1. That's it. Then I can, in my actual function call, I can have a variable representing that. So I could say number. And this means that when I call main, it's going to say 1, and that's equal to our number. So I can literally say alert our number on the script. When I hit go, it's going to now alert whatever I provide it. So I can provide it with a big number. It's going to alert that. I can provide it with a variable. I can provide it with a string, a text. And no matter what I provide here, it's going to allow me to translate that value into our actual function. This is more just for an organizational thing, because you can have variables globally. You can have a variable representing a number or something globally where you can access it from within any function. But in terms of organization, this is much better. So what do we want to send through here? We actually have some data in our script. We have these 2 inputs here, which we want these numbers. These are actual text boxes, so if we just get the text from within them, that's not good enough. But first, we should know, how do we get the text from inside of it? Well, first, we have variable names for these edit texts, which means we can simply call the variable names. I can say input 1 and input 2, but we don't want the actual edit text element. We want the text inside of it. So we're going to grab the property called .text inside of it. Now, we have 2 arguments you may have noticed. Before I just had 1. If we want to add multiple, we separate them with a comma. That's it. So we can have our number 1 and number 2 to represent our input text 1 and our input text 2. Then we can alert these, alert 1, alert number 2. Let's see what we get. We hit go, we get 4, which is our first input here, and then we get 60, which is our second input. And of course, if we change it, we get those numbers as well. But unfortunately, these aren't actual numbers. If I take, say, number 1 divided by 5, number 2 divided by 5 as well, and I alert it, well, okay, maybe I do get an actual value. Sometimes it may not come in as an actual value. JavaScript is one of those languages where sometimes things will be translated into the correct data type. Like if I take the letter A and I try and divide it by 1, that's not really an operation. But because in this case, the text is already a number, JavaScript kind of looks at it and says, oh, this should be a number and you're dividing it. But if we want to be extra specific to make sure we don't give it text, we give it an actual number that's inside of our UI, what we can do is surround our text call in a parse int. We'll say parse int before it, parentheses, and then end parentheses after our text. What this does is it parses a piece of text into an integer. An integer is just 0, 1, 2, 3, any whole number. You can also use things like parse float, and that will give you a float number which can have tons of decimals attached to it. In this case though, we just want that. So if I run this, we should get the same data alerted, but in this case, we're just making sure we convert our string to an integer. This can be a common important thing, especially as we're about to access our expressions, which even if it has numbers in our expression, they may come in as text. So now we can go ahead and look at this in respect to After Effects. A lot of that was just setup and the basics to get us started. Now we're going to get into actually accessing stuff. You know the concept of getting a variable, so we're going to create a variable called comp. This is going to be equal to our app, which refers to the application After Effects itself, the current project that's open, this doesn't matter if it's saved or untitled, and then the active item. This assumes that you have an active comp open down here and open here in your composition viewer. If you had something like a folder over here selected, that could also be the active item. So make sure that you have your composition open and selected. Again, if you want to check any of these values, you can get the comp.name, for example, run this. And in this case here, we get the actual name of our composition. And of course, you can refer to the guide to get all of these properties and attributes. Like, if you want the width, what's the width of our comp? 1664 in this case. And of course, you can store that in variables, do mathematics with it. But what we want to do now is get this first layer in our composition. After all, we have this expression which we want to get down to. So I'll create another variable called layer. We're going to set this equal to our comp because we already have our composition defined here. And to get this first layer, we can just say dot layer. And we're going to grab layer 1. Simple as that. If we wanted layer 10, we would just say layer 10. And in this case, we want layer 1. So let's do that. To make sure again that this is working, we'll say layer.name. We'll alert that just to make sure the value we're getting is proper. And in this case, although it's the same name as our comp, we do get the proper name of our layer plus .png. Now we need to get the position property. This is where scripting gets a little more complicated and you're going to have to start doing some research and learning, but we're going to access the position property. So I'll create a variable called position prop. We're going to set this equal to our layer and we need to access the position. You actually can say this. You can just say dot position. And if we were to alert the position prop now, you can see we get an object property. But there are other ways to get the same position property. You can say dot property Adobe transform group. This is called the match name, which is After Effects' internal way of basically saying, hey, here's the transform group. That's what we want to look at. Then there's another property inside called the position. So we can say dot property Adobe position, and that will give us the same exact thing here if we were to run it and alert it. We can of course also say alert the value, and it should give us the position value, X, Y, and Z. You can see it even gives you the Z value if it's a two-dimensional layer. So we have this code that gives us the position property. You can do the same thing, of course, and change this to Adobe scale, Adobe opacity, and it's going to give you those values for sure. As you can see, we have 100 opacity. I'm going to set this back to the shorthand, position.value. Actually just position, because we can access two things with the actual property. We have this value here, but we also have an active expression. So if I alert our position prop.value, it gives me this actual value of our position. But if I want to see what the expression is, all I have to do is say dot expression. If I run this, say go, you can see here we have our exact expression text. You could then store this as a variable, apply it to something else, modify the text inside of it, modify the numbers. We have all kinds of choices here. I'm not actually going to use this expression. I just wanted to illustrate how to access it. We can also actually access whether or not the expression is enabled. So we can say .expression enabled, and this is going to give us true or false as to whether an expression is applied. So if I remove my expression, you can see now expression enabled gives us false. Those are just a few important expression things for you as an expression pro to use in your scripting. So lastly, let's take a look at how we can change our actual expression. we're just going to grab our position prop dot expression, and we're going to set this equal to something. Now you can put expressions in single or double quotes. It just needs to be a string, but sometimes expressions themselves have quotes in them. So if your expression has double quotes in it, surround it with single quotes. If your expression has single quotes in it, to say represent a layer name or something, then use double quotes around it. So first, let's just set an arbitrary value. We'll say wiggle 999. Now when we run this and apply it, you can see we've applied our wiggle expression successfully to our layer. But remember, we have these two inputs. So how do we get number 1 and number 2 into our expression? You might be thinking, well, can't we just replace them here? Unfortunately, that's not quite the case, because if I run this, you can see it's going to put the physical text called number 1 and the physical text called number 2 in. That might be fine if you had them defined in your actual expression, like var number 1 is equal to 0, etc. But in this case, we want the actual value from the UI. So in order to get that, undo this, we're going to replace each of these inputs. I'm going to remove it. We're going to add our quotes. In this case, 2 single quotes. And it looks like it did nothing, but what we've basically done is added a space to add an external variable. We need to put 2 pluses to actually add something in between here, and same with here. And what are we going to add? Number 1 and number 2. So we're basically what's called breaking out of our string here, adding a physical JavaScript variable that was defined here, breaking back in, and then adding our second variable. This kind of gets complicated, but this will allow you to have scripts that interact and modify dynamically your expressions and other things in your script. So if I run this now, hit go, now we should have a working script where our wiggle expression takes on the actual values inputted into our UI. We don't even have to undo anything. We can just modify the values, 99, 100, go. Now we've modified our expression to have that, and we can continue making modifications and getting as detailed of interactions between scripts and expressions as much as you want. But that's going to do it for this video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. That's all about scripting for expression pros, basically how to get started writing scripts for those who have already gotten deep enough into After Effects to learn the ins and outs of expressions. You guys who are expression pros know math better than people who just write scripts from knowing After Effects. So you have a major upper hand, and I thought I would make this unique kind of video to explain and show how easy it can be for you as an expression pro to get into it. If you enjoyed the video, hit the thumbs up button. Down below, hit subscribe and the bell icon to be notified of new videos coming out twice weekly on the channel. And down in the description, you can follow us on GitHub for coding updates, as well as Instagram for other live updates. If you haven't already joined our Discord server, make sure you do so to get help with scripting, extensions, plugins, submit tutorial ideas, and much more. And if you'd like to help support us on YouTube, you can do so in the description down below by becoming a member or supporter, which comes with cool perks and helps us out financially. Also check out the other links below to AE Scripts, Gumroad, and Adobe Exchange to see some other cool stuff I make. Thanks again for watching, everyone. We'll see you next time.